Good morning everybody. Welcome to this Doyle Club presentation. Today we're going to talk about the implications of Brexit, how Brexit may affect your business and what you can do about it. So Brexit, what next? One way of looking at the problem of Brexit is to consider what the alternative models are. I'm going to start with one which is very similar to the EU and then work away to arrangements which are less like the EU. The first one is the European Economic Area, sometimes referred to as EU Lite. The main exponent of this, of course, is Norway, and Norway has been discussed in this context. So why wouldn't we have an arrangement like Norway's? Well, it gives them free movement in services and goods. They can trade in the EU, almost unrestricted, so that's a good thing. But the payment for that, of course, is to agree the four freedoms of the EU. Services and goods and capital, but also of people. I think after the vote that that's going to be quite a hard sell to the British public, but we shall see. They do make a contribution. They make less than we do, but it's still about £128 a head. It's quite a lot. So, would we want to do this? Well, I think not, actually, because one of the biggest problems with the EEA model is that they don't have a seat at the table. So they have to comply with all the rules and have the free movement, but they can't actually attend the meetings to negotiate anything. They are not actually involved in the decision making. And I think that's going to be very unattractive to the government and to the British public. But it's a possibility. The next possible model is the EFTA model that Switzerland has got. This was the original trading organisation in Europe called the European Free Trade Association. Switzerland is a successful country, very prosperous, so why wouldn't we do this? And I know that some Tory politicians prior to the vote were saying we can be like Switzerland. They make a financial contribution, it's much less, it's about £52 a head. They've had to negotiate very carefully, almost area by area, and they have very little leverage on services. So they can bring their goods into the EU without a tariff, which is a good thing, but they have limits on services. That may be unattractive to the UK. There's some indication amongst the Brussels bureaucrats that they do not want another arrangement like this. The arrangement with Switzerland was originally done as a precursor to Switzerland joining the EU. Well, they never did. So why would Brussels want another arrangement in that way? We shall see. But anyway, it's a possibility. The next possibility is to go for a customs union. This is the arrangement enjoyed by Turkey. Again, another successful growing economy. What it means for them is that they don't suffer any tariffs on any goods that they bring into the EU. In return, they've outsourced their tariff policy to the EU. So they don't actually control their own trade policy in goods. They have to follow the EU-wide tariff rules. That's perhaps quite a small price to pay to be able to bring their goods in. Doesn't apply to services, unfortunately. Again, this is supposed to be a strong area of the UK, but this model wouldn't allow you to do that. You'd have to negotiate each arrangement on a piecemeal basis. But a good thing is there's no financial contribution, so that again will be very attractive to the government. The next possibility is what you might call starting from scratch. There was quite a lot of news leading up to the vote about the trials and tribulations of Canada that had been through a 7-year negotiation with the EU. They were having to negotiate the arrangements almost piece by piece, and that's obviously complicated and drawn out. But it might be something that we'd be willing to do if the EU are willing to deal with this. We know that some of the commissioners have indicated that we can't assume that we can have the benefits of the EU without some of the downsides. Do we want uncertainty for 7 years? I doubt it. The ultimate position, of course, is not to have a negotiated deal with the EU at all. We would be like China or the United States, effectively external countries. Trade in these circumstances is dealt with through what's called the WTO, World Trade Organization. There are some rules to this. The most important is the most favoured nation concept. WTO members need to apply the same type of rules and tariffs that they apply to their most favoured nation, apart from any specific agreements that they've negotiated. WTO, unfortunately, excludes services, which is an area where the UK is supposed to be very strong. There is a general agreement on services which hasn't really been implemented very thoroughly, certainly not within the EU. So in terms of services, I don't think a WTO solution would give us much leverage. But those are the options anyway. And then what do we do about all the laws? One of the main areas that leavers complain about, of course, was all the bureaucracy associated with being in the EU. And it is true that the EU has been productive of a great number of regulations, directives, and the statutory instruments that follow on from it. We know that there is now a Ministry for Brexit and a Minister, David Davis. He's going to have to look at all this with his team. It's going to take years to do it, effectively picking through it to decide what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep. Of course, bear in mind that if you want to trade with the EU, you have to comply with some of their product regulations and so on. So it may be that the bonfire of directives is not going to be such a high and large bonfire. We will see. Time will tell. A word about the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice deals with questions about EU law and is not to be confused with the European Court of Human Rights, which we will still be involved with. So what does this mean for you and your businesses? What should you as business owners be looking for? What sort of plans should you make? Well, I've highlighted 5 areas that I'm going to talk about briefly. It's really a question of making contingency plans, because at the moment we don't exactly know what's going to happen. But I think we can look at the various aspects that I'm going to cover, and we can make some contingency plans. So, impact number 1, I think the biggest impact is going to be on employees. That was certainly the hottest topic in the vote. So let's just look at the background. The biggest number of people that have caused problems within the UK have come from the countries that acceded to the EU in 2004, the so-called A8 countries, which include the Baltic countries, Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, and of course Poland. In a sense, it was the 2004 countries that have actually driven the British public over the brink. So what's going to happen to them? Your organisation may be employing large numbers of individuals from these countries. You don't really want them to go and be sent back. What I would suggest for all of you is to look at your current workforce, look at your employees, look at the key people in your organisation and just identify which country they come from. Are they people you might want to support if they want to make a residence application? Some contingency planning here I think is very, very important. The EU has also produced a lot of labour protection legislation which has largely been accepted in the UK. For example, TUPE, transfer of undertaking regulations, are broadly accepted as fair on workers, and I doubt whether the government will go hell for leather and unravel those, because I think they've become generally accepted. We shall see. Working time directive is another one that's been complained about. I think this is more likely to be attacked by the current regime than TUPE. I think there needs to be greater flexibility in this, and I think we may see some change in that respect. The second impact will be on trading in general. I've already spoken about access to the single market and talked about goods and services. There is a lot of legislation that deals with tariffs. It's incredibly complicated. This is why a country like Canada has had to take five to 7 years to negotiate a deal. This table on the screen gives you an idea of just a taster of how complicated it is. There's a tariff of 9.8% on cars and automotive products. You can imagine, can't you, what the Nissan and Toyota executives who've got factories in the UK are thinking. Our factory's going to be outside the EU. We're going to be facing a 9.8% tariff. The government's got to do something about that because it's going to affect jobs if these large car companies decide to move production to the EU. The problem's multiplied across many, many sectors, and it comes down to the detail. Aluminium, financial services, food and beverages and so on. It's incredibly complicated. So what I would suggest to you as business owners is to consider your own organisation. If you have goods, materials, if you have finished goods, look at where they come from. Do they come from within the EU or outside the EU? And how do you trade? Do you trade by exporting to the EU? What sort of goods are you trading? Is it now time for you to consider setting up a subsidiary or a place of business outside the UK but in another EU country? I think it's not premature to start making some contingency planning in this area. The next big impact, I think, is foreign direct investment. I've mentioned the car plant situation a minute ago, but there's a lot more than that, isn't there? Companies come to the UK just because it's a way of getting into the EU. They may have nothing to do with cars. They could be in any industry. And certainly my business deals with American companies that have used the UK as an entry point into the EU. English speaking, easy to deal with, straightforward regulation. So you've got to think about, are you going to be affected by that? Maybe some of your customers are like that. Maybe you might see your customers moving. It's worth considering it. The next big area, I think, will be subsidy and grants. A lot of the EU budget is used either on regional funding or on specific growth projects. The slide shows a particular project to do with high-tech industries. It's called Horizon 2020. There is some anecdotal evidence around already that people applying for funding in high-tech industries, particularly through universities, are being told by their partners in the EU that they don't want to have a British name on the paper because they think it might be prejudicial. Does your organisation or do the customers that you deal with depend on some sort of grant? We know that the regions in the UK benefit from EU funding. Wales, for example, has regional funding and agricultural funding. Do your customers depend on such funding? Are they supported by it? These are all risks, but again, I think if you think about your customer base and your own businesses, you may be able to identify some problems coming down the track. The next possible impact is in the question of tax regimes and finance. The EU is very keen on corporation tax harmonisation. The UK government isn't. Leaving the EU would allow the UK government to apply the level of flexibility that it wants. I think we're going to see corporation tax continue to come down in the UK. I think the government wants to do this, and it's an opportunity to take the sting out of leaving the single market. What I think they'll do is continue to drop corporation tax rates to draw business into the UK. This may have the effect of mitigating some of the impact of foreign companies using the UK previously as a way into the EU. VAT, I don't think will change very much. I think the government is pretty much addicted to VAT. It needs the income. Inevitably there will be more flexibility about what they do with rates. They'll have more flexibility about cutting the rates or increasing them. But I think in terms of VAT disappearing, I don't think it's going to happen. The biggest concern I think this country's got is over financial services. Financial services for EU members have what's called a passport. This means that if you're an EU country, you're allowed to trade in services, in financial services, in other EU countries. That passport is probably going to be lost. It's going to be hard to negotiate to get the same rights that we've got at the moment. So, again, financial services, does your company work in the financial services area? Do your customers deal with financial service businesses? Again, contingency planning, thinking through how that might affect your business. It's worth doing it now. Well, I hope that wasn't too much of a gloomy resume of what Brexit might look like. I think the risks can be mitigated by careful planning, and there may well be opportunities. My contact details are on the screen. Please do contact me if anything occurs to you after today. But for now, if anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them. Thank you.